Here are all the topics that are covered in the US Constitution revision video. This topic is going to focus on the third and final principle of the US Constitution, and that is federalism. The three main principles of the US Constitution are separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. The Constitution's framers envisaged a constitution that would limit government and share the balance of power between the different branches. Each institution has powers to limit the others, as well as those reserved for that branch. The third and final principle of the Constitution is federalism. Federalism is a theory of government by which political power is divided between a national government and state government, each having their own areas of substantive jurisdiction. When advocating the concept of limited government, the original framers of the Constitution weren't thinking only of the government infringing on the rights of individual citizens. They were hoping to also limit the interference of federal or central government in the affairs of the separate states. The key term is reserved powers, meaning that as per the 10th Amendment, all powers not expressly delegated to federal government, such as trade and defence, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Yet here is another constitutional ambiguity. What does the phrase "or to the people" mean? If the people means the will of voters expressed through the election of Congress or the President, clearly not all residue powers necessarily lie within individual states. Not surprisingly, federalism is another idea of debate in relation to the US Constitution. America is essentially broken down into many different governments under one federal government. At the top, you have the US government led by the President. This government is the national government, which has the distinctive three branches. Next, you have a government for each state, which is 50. State government is led by the governor. In each state, the local government is broken down further into categories of county, city, town, school district, and special district. All in all, local governments total 89,476. When you put this together with the number of governments in America, that means there are 89,527 governments. Federalism is all about the division of power. To understand who gets what power, we must first understand the meanings of the different powers. Express powers are powers of the national government found directly within the Constitution. Inherent powers are powers belonging to the national government because it is the government of sovereign state within the world community. Implied powers are not expressly stated in the Constitution, but are reasonably suggested or implied by the expressed powers, for example, the necessary and proper clause. Exclusive powers are powers that can only be exercised by one form of government. Concurrent powers are powers that both the national government and the state possess and exercise. And reserved powers are powers that the Constitution does not grant to the national government and does not at the same time deny to the states. Here is the layout of the different powers with who possesses them. Express powers remain only with the national government, such as Congress's power to declare war. Concurrent powers are those that both the national government have and state governments also have. An example of this would be the power to levy and collect taxes, to define crimes and set punishments for them, and to claim private property for public use. Then there are exclusive powers, which are powers exercised only by one form of government, such as through national government, with their ability to make and ratify treaties with foreign states. There are different types of federalism, as it is not a fixed concept, it is ever-changing. From 1850 onwards, the role of the federal government has increased. It has changed for a variety of different reasons. Westward expansion changed the dynamic of federalism as America grew from 13 colonies to 50. The growth of the population from under 4 million in 1790 to 322 million by 2016 required a different style of management by a growing government. Industrialization brought the need for government regulation, and the Federal Executive Department of Commerce and Labor was formed in 1903. Improvements in communication has also affected federalism, as modern technology has made communication easier. The Great Depression is the most significant cause for change, as this influenced the federal-state relationship. I will go into this in more detail later on in the video. Foreign policy affects federalism, especially after World War II, which changed the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal governments. Supreme Court decisions alter the federal-state relationship, as decisions made by the Supreme Court further enhance the power of the federal government after 1937. Finally, there is constitutional amendments, especially the 13th and 14th Amendment, which for the first time saw the Constitution impose prohibitions directly on state governments. There are different versions of federalism through American history. The most common are dual federalism, which is often referred to as layer cake federalism. Federalism and state governments that are divided into their own spheres. Then there is cooperative federalism, which is often known as marble cake federalism. This is a mixture of power between and among the national, state, and local governments. There is also new federalism, which is an approach of federalism commonly characterized by a return of certain powers and responsibilities from the federal government back to the states. There is also creative federalism, also known as picket fence federalism. Creative federalism allows the government to decide what the state needs and then provide them with those resources. When the Constitution was written, it was widely understood that the federal government and the states would exercise different powers. The federal government would be responsible for all foreign affairs, national defense, and all interstate matters. The states would be responsible for anything else, including any powers not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. For most Americans, this meant that the majority of decisions affecting them would be made by their state government, which in principle best understood them and had their interest at heart. This relationship between the states and the federal government is known as dual federalism. In practice, the balance between the two tiers of government was never as neat as it sounded. During the First World War, for example, the government took direct control of industries that were essential to the war effort, and states did not always look after the best interests of all their citizens. For example, in the South, where African Americans looked to the federal courts to protect their interests from state governments that practiced racial segregation. Between the 1780s to the 1920s, the individual governments exercised the most political power. There was a big focus on states' rights. However, following the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression in 1929, there was a significant increase in the power and scope of the federal government. During the 1930s till the 1960s, the federal government made increasing use of the categorical grant schemes, by which it was able to stimulate how federal tax dollars were used by the states. Towards the end of the 20th century, there was a move towards decentralization, what President Nixon called New Federalism. This era saw the rise of block grants, money given to states by the federal government to be used at their discretion within broad policy areas. This change in federal-state relationship coincided with the administration of four Republican presidents: Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. In some ways, the states did not benefit much from these new trends in federalism. As the federal deficit increased in the 1980s, federal programs were cut. This gave a rise to a new term, the unfunded mandate, by which the federal government would legally require states to perform some function without providing any money with which to fund it. Since President Johnson left office in 1969, almost every president, both Republican and Democrat, has introduced programs to re-empower the states and restore a balance closer to the original model of dual federalism. These programs, although vary quite significantly, is often still seen as new federalism. In brief, they have worked as followed. President Nixon introduced general revenue sharing, which allowed the states to spend a greater proportion of their federal grants as they choose. Carter continued the general revenue sharing program of his predecessor, but also cut the amount of federal grants available to the states so that they would have become more self-dependent. Reagan made sharp cuts to funds available to the states, especially for welfare payments, as soon as he took office. He offered the states a new arrangement reminiscent of dual federalism, in which they would take full responsibility for some welfare programs, while the federal government would take over others in their entirety. This increased costs to the states of such an arrangement led to them to reject this proposal. Clinton oversaw an economic boom that led to the states building up surplus funds in many cases for the first time since the 1920s. These funds were then used in pioneer new policy ideas that suited the state's needs and priorities. For example, Wisconsin started a program to extend school choice by issuing families with education vouchers that could be used in any school, whether state-run or private. Although not committed to new federalism in principle, President George W. Bush responded to the attacks of 9/11 by increasing government control over any policy that related to national security. Then, when the economy deteriorated sharply in 2008, he introduced an economic stimulus plan that introduced substantial payments to struggling state governments. The first action of President Obama taking office in the midst of an economic crisis was an economic stimulus plan on an even greater scale than that of his predecessor. Overall, new federalism has illustrated the difficulty of achieving a relationship between the states and federal government that resembles the balance expected by the founding fathers. When the Great Depression struck in the 1930s, the balance between the states and the federal government was decisively altered. The states did not have the resources to help citizens who had lost their jobs and often their homes. The federal government did have the resources, and it used them in the New Deal to help those who were suffering and to stimulate the economy. However, this meant federal government involvement in welfare matters that had previously been considered the exclusive responsibility of the states. This changed the overlapping relationship between the states and the federal government, and it is often known as cooperative federalism. Notwithstanding the clear need to help those who were in no position to help themselves, the New Deal was fiercely resisted by the Conservatives in the 1930s, as it was seen as undermining the principle of federalism and weakening the most important constitutional protection of liberty. Even in the 21st century, some Conservatives regard the New Deal as the start of a slippery slope, leading to ever greater government and consequently reduced freedom. Liberals, in contrast, greatly admire the way in which the Constitution allowed the federal government to step in at a time of crisis and make productive use of government who would otherwise have been idle as a result of mass unemployment. Cooperative federalism continued after the Great Depression had ended, and as the federal government continued to play a major role through the Second World War and the Cold War. In the 1960s, the relationship between the states and federal government changed again. President Lyndon B. Johnson launched his Great Society program, which was designed to end poverty in the US. In his view, the states had never made a serious effort to tackle the concentrated pockets of poverty, often in the cities such as Los Angeles' South Central District, and therefore could not be relied upon to do so. His program often bypassed state government and worked directly with city or local authorities to implement anti-poverty projects. This further advance of the federal government into matters traditionally seen as the responsibility of the states is known as creative federalism. The Great Society program provoked backlash, however. Americans, almost of all political persuasions, agreed that federalism was in danger of becoming meaningless, as policies concerning communities up to 3,000 miles away were being made in Washington, D.C. The reason that federalism has taken so many forms is that none worked effectively. The only time that the states have enjoyed a resurgence has been during an economic boom. Whenever there has been a national crisis, the federal government has either chosen to assert dominance over the states or has been required to do so, often with the full backing of the states that have been powerless to cope with these events. Federalism has had many different consequences throughout the US government and its politics. The legal consequences are that there are a huge variety in state laws on such matters such as the age at which people can marry or drive or attend school. Laws also vary based on drugs and whether the death penalty can be used. For example, the death penalty is currently suspended in California, but is still used in Texas. This issue will be dealt with in both federal and state courts. There are policy consequences of federalism, as states can act as policy laboratories, experimenting with new solutions to old problems. Recently, we have seen this in healthcare provisions, immigration reform, affirmative action programs, and environmental policies. There is also consequences for elections. All elections in the US are state-based and run under state law, even the presidential election. Each state decides things like how the candidates will be chosen, how their name gets on the ballot paper, and how the mechanisms used for polling stations, punch cards or computers are chosen. Arizona has experimented with online voting, while Washington State and Oregon have moved to an entirely postal ballot. Finally, there are consequences for political parties, as it is important to realize political parties in America are essentially decentralized state-based parties. For example, Texas Democrats are more liberal than South Carolina Democrats. Federalism has had an effect on Congress in terms of state representation. This was highlighted in the 2016 election when Republicans in Colorado, North Dakota, and Wyoming decided not to hold either a primary or a caucus, but to choose their national convention delegates through a state party convention, which annoyed Trump, but there was nothing he could do about it. How does federalism work today? Well, there are both advantages and disadvantages to federalism. Let's start by looking at the advantages. It practices pragmatism. Running a country the size of the United States with such a diverse population is much easier to do if the power is given to the local officials. Likewise, state and local officials are closer to the problem of their areas, so it makes sense for them to choose policies to solve those problems. It also creates laboratories of democracy. State governments can experiment with policies, other states and the federal government can learn from their successes and failures. Now let's look at the disadvantages. It prevents the creation of a national policy. The United States does not have a single policy on one issue. It has instead 51 policies, which often leads to confusion. It also leads to a lack of accountability. The overlap of boundaries among national and state governments makes it tricky to assign blame for failed policies. Most Americans know little about their state and local governments, and turnout in state and local elections is often less than 25%. Citizens consequently often ignore state and local governments, even though these governments have a lot of power to affect people's lives. A key debate is whether or not the US Constitution is still fit for purpose in modern America. The Constitution has real flaws, such as its rigidity and uneven approach to protecting rights and liberties, as well as specific clauses such as that requiring the Electoral College. It has also been criticised for enhancing the role of the unelected judges, who carry out the task of interpretation. Yet the Constitution has its defenders, not least those who argue that the real flaws lie in how contemporary politics is played out in the US. Operating within a political culture characterised by deep polarisation, hyperpartisanship, the Constitution is arguably not allowed to function effectively, as opposed to being fundamentally flawed. Where then does the truth lie? One way to approach this is to evaluate the pros and cons of the Constitution via two approaches. First, in terms of some of its specific clauses, and second, in respect of its broader structure and nature.